delivery of a programme of public realm improvements across the city. Anything from a new bench in the park to a new highway roundabout scheme to refurbishment of city centre toilets such as Lion Yard. I've come along to talk to you tonight about a proposal that has worked its way through the process, which is to consider the introduction of a Verge parking restriction in Hedges Road and Ramsden Square. The paper in front of you sets out the results of local public consultation on this proposal and seeks to steer on the preferred way forward. By way of background, Section 3 sets out the background to the situation and the particular proposal. This emerged as an environmental improvement programme bid a year or two ago, and Appendix A lists the actual bid that was considered. I think at this stage it's important to acknowledge that this is actually a widespread issue across the city. It's not just one that affects this particular area or this particular ward or even this particular area committee, if you like. But this is the first one that we've actively taken forward, the consideration of a specific traffic order to prohibit parking on verges. The scope and constraints of the project are set out largely in Section 3, and certainly some funding has been allocated to this project, which is intended to fund the introduction of a traffic order to make parking in these areas a fence. It's not intended to be sufficient to look at reconstructing these areas of verges to any great degree, although it is hoped that by restricting the parking on the verges, they will in time recover to a much better standard. Depending on the physical works costs with the proposal, if approved, we may find that there's scope within that budget allocation to do some minor reseeding work and that sort of thing. We'll know that a bit further down the line as we get into the detail. But it's not intended to reconstruct the verges as some other environmental improvement programme bids have been. The draft proposal was consulted on towards the latter part of the summer, and that's outlined in Appendix B to the report, which hopefully you had a chance to have a look at. We distributed around 300 local questionnaires to addresses, as shown on the map and overlay area. We had just over 50 back, so that was quite a reasonable rate of return, just under 20% or so. So I think we're fairly pleased with that. Support was mixed and varied between the two roads in question. It was slightly in favour by 2/3 to 1/3 in Hedges Road, but split very, very evenly in Ramsden Square. The problems are not dissimilar in the two roads, although the geography is a little different, and the on-street parking situation is a little different. And some of the themes that have come through from residents responding to the consultation are set out again in the appendix, and a number of people were concerned about where people would park if they weren't able to park on the road, whether this would actually worsen road safety, whether it would lead to parking displacement into other areas, perhaps less appropriate areas or more inconvenient areas. And there is some officer commentary set out in the paper in response to some of those concerns that people have raised. The implications of proceeding with this proposal are also set out in the paper, and I think in terms of both the financial implications and the staff and resource implications, those are covered by the way the project has been set up and structured so far. In environmental terms, it is hoped that the scheme, if introduced, would lead to an environmental improvement of the Verge area, the aesthetics of the verges. But of course, there would need to be some signing to let road users know that it would be an offence to park on these areas. So, there's a plus and there's a negative. But I think overall, the view is that it would be a medium improvement to the positive side. In terms of consultation, what we've undertaken so far is just the informal upfront consultation. If you support moving this proposal forward to the next stage, then the County Council as the Highway Authority will be the responsible authority for taking forward and advertising the traffic order. That's the statutory side of the consultation. and in considering and determining any objections that might come forward through that process. Those are most likely to be done by the Cambridge Joint Area Committee. In terms of community safety, I think we feel that the proposal is overall neutral. People would tend to need to park on occasions further from their home, but hopefully they would park in a more considerate and safer manner, so there will be a benefit there. So overall, I think we feel that it's generally neutral. So just really to sum up, the decision that we're really looking for from you this evening is a clear steer really on whether to proceed with this proposal to the next stage or not, in the light of the consultation feedback that we've received and the commentary laid out in the paper. And I'll be more than happy in responding to any questions that you might have in terms of steering toward the conclusion.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. Councillor Price.
Thank you, Chair. As the Ward Councillor that brought this originally to North Area Committee in August 2013 with a request for funds from the Environmental Improvement Programme. This was based on residents asking us to do something about the state of King's Hedges Road, Verges and the state of Ramsden Square, where at this time of year in particular, or certainly rainy times, driving along there, it resembled a plough field. The consultation process has gone ahead. You said it's fairly pretty much in favour on King's Hedges Road, and 50-50 pretty much in Ramsden Square. I would urge this committee to look at them in the round, and that we should go for both schemes, because there is merit in both schemes. The environmental improvement that it would bring to the area, I think outweighs any objections.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Price. Councillor Tunbridge.
Yes, do you see this as setting a precedent which will make it possible to have similar treatment in other areas?
Yes, indeed. I think a lot of the sort of particularly the sort of the residential estates, the sort of the council house estates, suffer sort of post-war, immediate post-war, and into more housing estates suffer similar difficulties, as does all the housing on the ring road around Cambridge, so Burn Road, Moby Road, Fendon Road, those sort of areas. A lot of the sort of main principal roads have similar concerns. I think it is something that needs a consistent approach citywide. That's not to say that the solution needs to be exactly the same in every single road across the city, but I think there needs to be almost a consistent framework by which these sort of things are assessed, and the solution in one road may well end up looking very different to the solution in another road. But I think it needs, because the problem is very consistent across the city, it needs to be approached in, with a similar frame of mind.
Yeah, I would caution against any decision made by this committee having anything other than an impact beyond this committee, because surely a city-wide solution needs to go to CTAC. The new Cambridge Joint Area Committee to consider that. So what we should be doing is looking. So I don't know why I'm going off on one. I think we need to avoid looking for a one-size-fits-all solution, because these surveys actually show the problem with the one-size-fits-all. Given people generally are more likely to respond to a survey if they agree with it when it comes sorted, because there's a general attitude of the city are going to do it, so the council are going to do it anyway, they've made up their minds. If we've got a 50-50, I think we have to either get more data to see whether actually there is support for it, or be minded to delay it or put it off. King's Hedges Road, yes, no brainer, we've got the support there. But Ramsden Square, I would be very cautious about proceeding with just on this data. I think we need to avoid a one-size-fits-all solution. Clearly, the issues in Ramsden Square are seen as different by the Ramsden Square residents to the issues in King's Hedges Road. And I'll repeat myself if I keep going, so I'll stop.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Smart.
Yes, Chair. I appreciate Councillor Pitt's views on taking note of the data. Obviously, residents come first. I think the thing is, if you think that through, it's a bit like the residents' parking problem. Clearly, King's Hedges Road is the one that's perhaps more severely affected, and that's why residents on King's Hedges Road are more in favour of it. But in responding to that, as councillors, we have to sort of take into account our own understanding, a more holistic understanding of the situation. And of course, if we implement the scheme on King's Hedges Road, clearly people are going to park on Ramsden Square, more so. And so what do? Do we assume that will happen and let's not react because the data says 50-50, and so we leave it and then everyone parks, and later on, 2 years later or something, we actually do Ramsden Square as well? Clearly that is going to happen, so I think we have to be sensible about this. And also the demarcation between Ramsden Square data and King's Hedges data is slightly arbitrary. It's just different roads, different data. It's one whole scheme. If you put the data together, then the whole lot is in favour, basically. So that's what I think on that. I wanted to also say, the Verges are a space for families and children to come out on, to have picnics for children to play, and space generally. If spaces are always given over to car parking, then we feel our lives as people who live in the city become more and more oppressive. I think that's got to be taken into account. And finally, I just wanted to say that the comment that Mr. Richards made about the recovery of the Verges is not satisfactory, and the way that these things work, it seems, from sort of other things like graffiti on walls and such like, is if you allow a space to stay the same as it is, it will just carry on getting worse. So the way to fix that is to not have tire tracks in the Verges and such like, because otherwise it encourages carry on parking the Verges even busily. So I would say we really need to try and find some money to do what we can with those Verges to at least make them look like they've not been parked on going forward, and that will help to fix the problem as well in terms of what people's perceptions of the Verges is.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Austin and then Councillor Manning.
I would support the looking at it in a wider scheme and rolling it out to other areas as well. We've had problems in Westchester and Metcalfe, quite aware people have parked on the Verges. It's exactly the same sort of problem. Of course, they're the vocal ones who complain about it. So what I'm not sure is what the other side of the argument is, and I am slightly concerned about the data here, only having responses from 53 people across 2 areas. It's very low, is it statistically, are we actually taking that statistically valid? 18% suggests, I'm surprised that there's so much interest in it, because it's quite a big change for people if they're used to parking in front of their houses and all of a sudden it's going to change. So I just wonder why the response rate is so low. So 2 different things there.
I'd like to comment on those questions, Chair.
Yeah, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I think, in pure numbers terms, I think it's a little disappointing that we didn't have, say, 100 responses. 18% isn't bad as a percentage response. To something like this, we might expect at best 10, typically. I think we tried to time it such that the time was just right, so it was at the end of once people returned from sort of summer holidays and that sort of thing, back into sort of the sort of general sort of annual seasonal cycle. So I don't think there's much we can do to elicit a greater response rate than we actually receive. I think, and perhaps one thing I haven't mentioned in the introduction is that the behaviour that's happening at the moment is the indication of need there. That there are more cars than there appear to be space for them to park easily within properties. So almost an inevitable consequence of moving forward with something like this is that you displace the parking to somewhere else. Now, the hope is that you displace that into a better overall position, but there is a concern that actually you end up just chasing the problem. And I think the comments that have been raised by some councillors tonight that if you just were to do King's Hedges Road and not Ramsden Square, then the likelihood is that a lot of those people who currently park on the Verges in King's Hedges Road, because Ramsden Square is so adjacent and so convenient and not a major traffic route, I think they would look to park in those in that particular road. If we were to include Ramsden Square, they would have to perhaps travel a little bit further into Lovell Road or some of the other roads, which might be a bit further for them. So there's perhaps a little bit less chance that they might displace, but still some chance, of course. In terms of a sort of a needs-based approach, depending on individual circumstances, I think what we're advocating here is that, and there's two schools of thought on this, in providing for this need. Either you do something to control it and try and provide for it somewhere else, or accommodate it somewhere else, or you look to strengthen the verges that are there to actually accommodate that parking, which could also be seen to be encouraging it. So it's about finding the right balance for the particular area in question, I think. And this proposal, and in the past we have strengthened verges elsewhere in the city, where they have been a specific environment improvement bid to provide for that need and actually accommodate it on verges. The sort of drive on this one, a little bit different, was about actually trying to restore the verges again and prevent people parking on them. So that's why we've gone down the route that we have. But yeah, I think the framework in which this is developed across the city needs to be consistent. But as I say, as I was alluding to earlier, the actual solution is often going to be geared towards the local need.
Okay, thank you, John. Do you let's say you've got the 3 points from the council man, report of council pick again.
I take Martin's point about discretion over data and it's absolutely right, but I think what I encourage everyone to think in terms of is that there's one very clear result and there's one 50-50 result, 48-48 result. But saying no doesn't mean never do it. And the sensible thing in my view would be, rather than pushing everything where a thing you've got 50-50 support, it would be to say, let's do it, and maybe in a modified way. Probably we have to go back to CJAC now because the delegations have changed. So let's take that scheme back. I've got the Verge prohibiting scheme in my division that I've consulted on initially, which I initially thought had resident support, and I came back and I did an informal survey very similar to this. So what I initially envisioned as a simple ban on Verge down the street is now being right now developed further into take some of the verges away to give some parking, which is against my principles in some ways, but meets the desires of some residents, but then ban any new encroaching of verges, which is very similar to a scheme that Mike, you presented at CJAC, where you found a compromise that stops it getting any worse, but gains resident support. So I strongly think that what we should be doing here is, with that said, not saying no, not saying never, just saying let's take it back and go through CJAC and do a bit more consultation and have a modified scheme.
Okay, Councillor
my view is that it is quite simple, and I'll agree with Councillor Price and disagree with Councillor Pitt, in as much as that, although the consultation returned a 2-to-1 majority in favour of it in King's Hedges Road and a 50-50 in Ramsden Square, if we just implemented it on King's Hedges Road and displaced parking, in my opinion, would soon sway the residents' attitude in Ramsden Square. And so I think the only way forward is to go with both of those schemes.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Pitt, you want to?
Yeah. I just kind of follow up because it seems to be the statement that Ramsden Square then will get all the overflow parking. Well, if there is the overflow parking, if we do Ramsden Square, it can't go to Lovell Road, because if anyone's ever tried to cycle down Lovell Road there and drive down it, it's a challenge. It can't go to St Kilda Avenue. I think we are going to get overflow knocking out problems wherever it is. So I'm just thinking that actually let's look at what the data is telling us, because where the overflow goes to is going to be the next issue, whether we do both or one. So I think saying the overflow is definitely going to go to Ramsden Square. I don't think it's clear that it is, but wherever we go to it will be the next issue. Well, a one, but the next issue.
Yeah, it may well be. I mean, to some extent it is an intractable problem in terms of knock-on effects. We have one specific recommendation from Council Price regarding 2.2 on page 39, which mentioned in the recommendation, the 2.1 is straightforward, 2.2, what is proceed proposal, and then on both I and Road, Council Price suggested both, other councils have. We help getting up planning, you suggested possibly alternative to that. If you do have an alternative to put forward, then we'll vote on that.
I would say proceed with the King's Hedges Road and refer the Ramsden Square to the Cambridge Joint Area Committee for further consideration.
Okay.
I might agree. I don't know what second that unfortunately.
Do you have a second? Council time. Okay, well, looking on board debate, I think it's quite straightforward what the points have been made on. Do we vote on that recommendation? Is everyone clear on that? From Council? Can you repeat your Claire is saying to jot it down?
Form to proceed to the proposed formal I'll start that sentence again.
Yes.
To proceed formal statutory draft order on the King's Hedges proposal and to refer the Ramsden Square proposal to the Cambridge Joint Area Committee for further consideration.
Okay, everyone got that? We go to a vote on that because there's no county council can vote on this, I'm afraid.
Just explain that to you.
Yeah. Okay, so Councillor Pitt's recommendation, is it all those in favour? 2. And Councillor Price's proposal, which is, I think, essentially, in terms of the proposal, the formal statutory draft, happy order today on both of these 2 votes. Yep. That's correct. Yep, okay. All those in favour? Okay, that's how things will go ahead. Thank you, John, for coming. Oh, sorry, yes, absolutely right. Yes, vote on recommendation as a whole. All those in favour? Thank you, Councillor. And just to say that I want to wish you all a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.